Ladies and gentlemen, I would be very happy if you can take a seat so that we can begin with our interesting and fantastic conference. Thank you very much. Thank you. Before I welcome you for interpretation, number 2 is English, numéro 3 français, 8 espagnol. 8 espagnol, 3 français, 2 English. If you want to listen to this, you can choose the channel of the language you would like to listen in. Now, Your Excellencies, President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, Chairwoman Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, Ministers, Ambassadors, Honourable Members, dear Advisory Board members of the Women in Parliament Global Forum, and dear fellow women in parliaments. A very warm and wholehearted welcome to the European Parliament here, to the annual summit of the Women in Parliament's Global Forum. I am absolutely thrilled and delighted and can say that on behalf of the Advisory Board of the Women in Parliament's Global Forum, that this is a truly unique and, I dare say, even historic gathering of female parliamentarians from around the globe. Because never before it has happened that all female parliamentarians have been invited to come together and to address challenges which face us around the globe by using the specific strengths and the collective thought and intelligence that women bring to parliaments. And never before have so many female parliamentarians, and these are around 400 from more than 100 different countries, have actually come together to discuss over several days those issues that are at stake. The summit will discuss issues of female political empowerment, a subject that we all live every day and that is very important to us, but we also go beyond that. We go beyond the classical gender issues and discuss, for example, matters on the economic agenda, but also on the security policy agenda. I hope it will be exciting and inspiring and energizing, and welcome again to this annual summit. Thanks for coming here. I will now pass over the microphone to the Vice President of the European Parliament, Anni Podimata, who will welcome you on behalf of the Parliament. Thank you.
Colleagues and friends, on behalf of the European Parliament and its President, Martin Schulz, I would also like to warmly welcome you in our premises in my capacity as Vice President of this institution. Allow me first to congratulate Silvana Koch-Marin, as without her initiative, without her tenacity and hard work, this event of Women in Parliament's Global Forum would never have taken place. The international conference we are hosting today is an event of major importance. It is a premiere. I think I'm not wrong in affirming that it is the first time that the European Parliament welcomes such a large amount of women, but of course also men, who are mostly welcome at such a very high level of representation. Members of parliaments around the world, members of governments, former or in charge, members of international institutions. It's certainly also a premiere that so many women representatives at the highest level from all over the world are meeting here today. Dear colleagues, dear friends, as we all know, despite many different legal instruments being enforced right now, equality is still not a reality for millions of women in Europe and across the world. There never will be complete equality until women themselves help to make laws and elect lawmakers. These words, allow me to remind you, were pronounced by Susan Anthony, who participated to the establishment of the Declaration of Rights for Women in the USA in July 1876. And this is certainly true today. And it is following this path that we will meet these 3 days, trying to find ways, exchanging ideas, creating bonds and synergies, and cooperating efficiently in order to make things better together. I believe that this is our key word, unity and togetherness. I'm sure, with these words in mind, that we will have very constructive and fruitful works, and that we will renew our mutual commitment to continue fighting for a real and substantial gender balance at the national, European, global decision-making level. Thank you very much. Now, allow me to introduce you a short video message that we have received from the President in exercise of the European Union, the President of Lithuania since 2009, Ms. Dalia Grybauskaitė. She regrets not being able to be here with us today. She sends our best wishes for our conference, and let's listen to the message that she has sent to us.
Dear Members of Parliament, welcome to the annual summit of the Women in Parliament's Global Forum. We have a goal that unites us all, the desire to create a better life for our families, citizens and countries. So that is why women must be more actively involved in nominating themselves for leadership and participating in businesses and politics. It is very important that the number of women in national parliaments should keep growing. Women can become a powerful force if they believe in their own potential and talent. Successful economy, successful politics, and successful scientific research are created by the mind, not the gender. So I wish the forum successful work. Dear Members of Parliament,
thank you very much. We might convey her the message that we would have liked to listen to it twice. It was so good and concise. Thank you. Now we have an extraordinary speaker who is not mentioned in the program for right now, but for a later point, but she is able to already speak to us now. And she does not really need any introduction because she's one of those female global leaders that we all are looking at and just admiring. But please give a warm welcome to Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, the first female president She, of course, is the first elected female head of state in Africa. Twice, if you would like to stand. And she's not only... Would you like to sit?
Thank you very much, Madam President of the African Union Commission, Madam Prime Minister, honorable members of Parliament, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I regret that I could not join you in your opening session, but it's a pleasure to be here today to participate in the Women in Parliament annual summit. I reflect back on the past 120 years since the women of New Zealand first received suffrage. The struggle that started many decades and continents ago is far from fulfilling its promise, but we have made great strides, and there's no turning back. Today, Africa is proud to have a female prime minister, one female vice head of state, and two female heads of state, one of whom will face elections in 2 years, and the other will leave office within 4 years. This represents a particular challenge as we must make sure that there's someone that will succeed us when we move on. We have a steadily rising number of women in parliament, up by more than 11% since 1995. Southern Africa has done especially well, with some of the largest proportion of women in local government, parliament, and cabinet in the world. The Seychelles parliament has 44% women, South Africa 42%, Mozambique 30%. Furthermore, 41% of South Africa's cabinet ministers are women, as are 32% in Mozambique. This regeneration is expertly illustrated by immense strides made in gender equality in Rwanda. After parliamentary elections in September, the proportion of women in the country's lower house reached an unprecedented 64%, the highest in the world. Many attribute this transformation to the post-conflict reconstruction process, where women, girls, boys, and men work together to rebuild the country. However, I attribute this to the enlightened leadership of President Zuma and President Paul Kagame, who leveled the playing field through constitutional and legislative reform. In Liberia, women now occupy 31% of senior ministerial positions, and the numbers are swelling. On International Women's Day this year, I resubmitted the Gender Equity Bill to our legislature, which calls for 30% of all institutions of governance to be occupied by women. Despite the correction of long years of neglect, it is not easy for a woman president to convince legislative colleagues on the need to expand the power of women. However, we will continue to press until this legislation is passed. Advances in gender equality are not confined to governance. Across Africa, many more girls and boys are enjoying gender parity in education. Legal restrictions limiting women's economic participation have been halved since 1960. And many countries are starting to pass laws and provisions to improve women's access to land and inheritance. These advances are remarkable and demonstrate great faith in Africa's future. With strong leadership on gender equality and equal representation in government, our continent will continue to make steady advances in women's education and equal access to services, thereby laying the foundation for more stable and peaceful societies. This hopeful and rosy picture must not, however, cover the reality and the great challenges that we face in trying to break down traditional beliefs of oppression and subjugation that are perceived to be natural social orders. For every woman president, For every woman senator or corporate leader, millions of others are kept in servitude, relegated to a lower level of echelon in society. 70% of the 1.3 billion living in extreme poverty are women, who perform 66% of the world's work and produce half of its food. Thousands of African women continue to be denied access to power and resources, to be discriminated against, to suffer restricted mobility, to be married off as young brides. These women often lack access to the most basic services, including sexual and reproductive health care. Advances in these areas require continuing strong, decisive leadership from both men and women in positions of power. In Liberia, we are working hard for gender equality on many levels, from personal security to political and economic empowerment. We are still dealing with the sad legacies of the past. We are still confronting lingering social values which tend to treat women as lesser beings. My election to the presidency 8 years ago was a momentous occasion because it signified that our people were able to rise above ancient beliefs in women's inferiority, to accept that a professional person with integrity from any gender can lead a nation out of the ashes of destruction. Nevertheless, this giant step for one woman does not necessarily mean progress for the great majority. It is the first step in a march that must be sustained. Violence against women is one of the most persistent and most neglected injustices. Around the world, there are as many as 1.5 billion people currently affected by conflict and organized political violence. Thousands, even millions of women in these countries will be vulnerable to exploitation and abuse, with profound effects on their physical and psychological well-being. The cessation of hostilities does not mean peace of mind for all, especially women. They bear the scars of conflict more than anyone else. These injuries affect their ability to work, to pursue a livelihood, and fulfill familiar and community roles. The economic cost to the victim's family, community, and society are enormous. I thus applaud the leadership of British Foreign Secretary William Hague and the UN Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, Zana Bangura, who is here, for pursuing the Declaration of Commitment to End Sexual Violence in Conflict, which was signed in September by 113 countries, including Liberia. The declaration contains practical and political commitments to end the use of rape and sexual violence as a weapon of war. We equally applaud the leadership of the African Union, represented by the Commission President here, Dr. Zuma, which has developed a roadmap on women in conflict, including activities such as the appointment of a special representative of sexual violence in armed conflict and the training of African Union staff on the provisions of UN Security Council Resolution 1325. In Liberia, through the pain and anguish experienced by each of these victims, we have found the strength and the courage to start to build a new transformed society where women enjoy equal rights and fair treatment, and where their productive role in society and the economy is acknowledged. In my country, women occupy high-ranking government positions. Rape, though continuing, has been criminalized, and women have greater property and custodial rights. Now, a few thoughts on the way forward. First, we must better understand the challenges posed by gender inequality, particularly that relating to sexual violence. We need to understand the root causes of discrimination and to tackle them head-on. Better data and monitoring will be crucial. The post-2015 high-level panel called for a data revolution through the new Global Development Agenda. This data revolution is pivotal for true gender equality. Second, we must continue to push for high female representation in politics. We have come a long way, but we cannot afford to be complacent. The presence of more women amongst lawmakers will make a positive influence on political processes and rights. They must occupy decision-making positions and have the opportunity to show leadership in other sectors. Not only is this morally right, it also makes good economic sense. Women's empowerment spurs economic performance and boosts income. Third, we must create space for civil society to hold governments accountable. In Liberia, a lively civil society is a vital spur for our progress. And in Southern Africa, for example, the 2008 Protocol on Gender and Development finally came into force in the year 2012, in large part thanks to civil society pressure and a strong culture of accountability. Finally, we must carefully examine our cultural and social norms to understand why gender inequality is tolerated and perpetuated. National programs to redress inequalities, and in particular to eradicate gender-based violence, must draw on traditional structures and community leaders, for they are the gatekeepers of norm and cultural practices. Working in partnership with these leaders, both male and female, we can start to reconstruct the ideologies that fuel this scourge as we seek true social transformation. The new measures for social progress must be looked at from the perspective of gender equality, the way in which society treats its people, how it respects the individuality and rights of every human being, how every person is given the same opportunity, the same justice, and the same freedom. This is a struggle that must be waged by men and women all over the world. Indeed, we have made some progress in women equality, and there can be no turning back. I thank you.
Thank you so much, President Johnson. There could be no better and more inspiring speech to open our conference. Your inspiring speech confirms your permanent dedication to something you have said in the past, that if your dreams do not scare you, they're not big enough. So thank you very much. Now, I have the honor to ask another extraordinary personality who dedicated her life not only fighting for women's rights, but fighting for human rights, and former anti-apartheid activist in South Africa, former Minister of Health under President Mandela, former Minister of Foreign Affairs under Presidents Becky and Moland, the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Ms. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, to take the floor.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, President of Liberia, Your Excellency, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Ms. Portia Simpson, Excellencies, Prime Ministers, Ministers, Honorable Members of Parliament, of course, organizers of this historic event. I'm honored to address this landmark annual summit of the Women in Parliament's Global Forum, and our appreciation goes to the European Union Parliament for hosting and organizing this forum this year. As has been mentioned, we are also celebrating the anniversary of 120 years of women's suffrage with our New Zealand sisters, who became the first in the world to give women the vote and to vote. This anniversary is not only their celebration, but it has to be a global celebration, including the 9,723 women parliamentarians who are in the driving force behind this forum. Your theme for this year's Global Forum speaks to the role of women in the advancement of society. The struggles of the early suffrage and women's movements were not only about women's rights to vote or to be elected, but about the betterment of society as a whole. In the words of Emmeline Pankhurst, who explained in 1913, I quote, "We are women fighting for a great idea, that we wish the betterment of the human race, and that we believe this betterment is coming through the emancipation and upliftment of women," close quote. It was this wish for the betterment of the human race that saw the First World Conference of Women in Mexico reminding the world that in subscribing to the Charter, the peoples of the United Nations undertook specific commitments to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. And 20 years later, in Beijing, the women declared that they advance the goals of equality, development, and peace for all women everywhere in the interest of all humanity. So women today constitute 21.3% of the world's parliamentarians. Of course, as has been said, Rwanda leading all of us with over 60%. In 46 countries across the world, women account for more than a quarter of all MPs. I'm also proud to say that 14 of those countries are in Africa. For Africa, this progress, according to Femme Afrique Solidarité, is mainly as a result of two factors, and we can also add a third one. That is women's activism for equal representation and the introduction of quotas. Quotas have seen to women's representation on the continent evolve from 14% in 1992 to 30% by 2012, with women making up more than half of the global population, yet holding an average of 15% political power and 21% inclusion in parliaments. The African continent stands out as an example of quota success and women-led activism. And I think quotas sometimes are misunderstood. People think that quotas mean something else other than merit. All that quotas do is to focus the mind to find the women of merit to take the position. However, the fact that only 2 countries globally have 50% women in parliament means that this struggle for equal representation is far from over. Excellencies, honorable members of parliament, ladies and gentlemen, the Beijing Platform of Action identified 12 critical areas which the women's movement has struggled for in the quest for better humanity and a better world. These critical areas include women and poverty, education and training, health, violence against women, women in armed conflict, women and the economy, in power and decision-making, women, human rights, institutional mechanisms, the media, environment, and the girl child. On all these areas, we're making advances through policy, legal and institutional means, through advocacy, activism and mobilization, and through the voices and actions of women in parliament, government, business, in the judiciary and civil society. But at the same time, as our world changes at a faster pace than ever before, we are confronted by new challenges and by old challenges in new forms. Women account for 70% of the world's poor. And if they stay poor, will add to the cycle of intergenerational poverty. I'd like to quote Mary Hawkinsworth in her 2006 book on globalization. And she makes example of how macroeconomic policy, the rollback of the state in societal services, and the shift away from human security contributes towards this cycle of poverty. I quote, she says, "The reduction in the number of state employees affects women disproportionately as they tend to be the ones working in social welfare agencies, schools, and hospitals. At the same time, the parts of the state that are not negatively affected by privatization tend to be male-dominated: police, military, commerce, and finance. In this sense, structural adjustment policies contributed to a regenderizing of the state on the basis of male privilege. Additionally, the loss of jobs in the formal or formally contracted and paid economy tends to push women into the informal sector with low pay and no recognition. Sometimes people talk about the informal sector and the involvement of women in very romantic terms. The women are there, it's a harsh place to be. All women would like to be in the formal sector, but the conditions are such that they are in the informal sector. And she draws attention to women and migration today. And she says, some 60 million women, drawn predominantly from poor nations, constitute a mobile labor force, crisscrossing the globe in search of a livelihood. Certain migratory circuits have been well mapped. South Asia to the Middle East, former Soviet states to Western Europe, Mexico and Central America to Canada and the United States, and Africa to Europe. These migrants are usually employed as domestic workers, care workers, or even sex workers because of what is called the care deficit. With the increase of women in the workforce in richer countries, someone else has to take on the care they can no longer perform. This care deficit is the pull factor that attracts migrant women to core countries. At the same time, the care deficit exists because, as women took on jobs outside the house, men have not increased their participation in housework. On average, a woman still has to spend 15 hours more than a male partner on housework, not counting childcare. In this sense, the availability of migrant women has not only allowed women in wealthier countries to join the workforce, they have already done that for both personal and economic reasons, but it has allowed men not to take on their share of household work. And as our sister, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, reminded us yesterday, we also face the scourge of human trafficking, what she correctly calls slavery by the back door. These disproportionate and unpaid domestic burdens that women continue to carry greater impacts on their time availability for productive or paid work. Women and work certainly is nothing new, as the quote illustrates. The workforce is newly central to women's lives. But of course, women have always worked. They worked in the fields, in the gardens, in the homes. They looked after children, nursed the sick, prepared food, sometimes scratching from very meager resources. They sewed and mended clothes. They fetched the water from the rivers. They looked for firewood, and they worked their fingers to the bone, as the saying went. But of course, as women, more and more women enter the labor market in the formal and informal sectors, but also in atypical work, in especially the services sector, we must pay greater attention to workers' rights and conditions, to social policy, public transport, including affordable childcare for working and other women and parents. In addition, and especially in developing countries, of course we have to invest in infrastructure, but especially in bringing clean water to the home, sanitation, affordable energy, because all these are chores that are done by women. If energy is not available, it's the women who go and fetch the wood. If water is not available, there is no man who cares about where the water comes from. All they say is, I want a cup of tea, I want to bath. They don't care how we have warmed that, we have boiled that water. So as women parliamentarians, we must ensure that the policies and the laws we pass free women from these chores and make sure that they have access to water, to energy, so that they can go to productive work. And so that their children also do not have to suffer the diarrheal diseases that they get from having to get water from rivers. In addition, and especially looking at the Millennium Development Goals, we must focus on the education of girls without neglecting the education of boys. And in Africa, male-female primary education completion ratios were achieved in 10 countries by 2012, and 21 African countries have achieved parity in the ratio of progression to secondary school. And since educating a woman still means educating a generation, contributing to healthier families and communities and to productivity, we do need a bigger push on access to education and training for girls and boys, of course. This should include expanding access to higher and vocational education and training, to science and technology, research and innovation. More broadly in Africa, we talk about the need for a skills revolution to give our young people and women a greater stake in the future. We have also advanced in terms of health issues, including women's reproductive rights, reducing maternal and child mortality, the burden of HIV, AIDS, TB, and malaria, but we still need to do more. However, we do need to pay attention to address the glaring inequalities of a world that can feed everyone. Our world can feed everyone, and yet children still die of malnutrition and go without meals. In particular, in the developing world and Africa, we must empower women in rural areas to play a greater role in agricultural production and agro-processing, since they constitute the majority of workers in agriculture. And of course, honorable members, the first waves of global, regional, and national feminists and women's movement have seen advances in terms of greater awareness of women and gender issues, reflected in policy and legal reforms. At the same time, globalization has added new dimensions, greater inequality within and across countries and regions, and there's been a backlash against some of the advances we've made. More fundamentally, despite increasing labor market participation of women, very little has changed in terms of patriarchal relations of production and reproduction. All countries across the globe report widespread feminization of poverty, inequality and persistent gender disparities in income, in economic participation and ownership, to the extent that Norway had to introduce forced quotas for company boards. The Prime Minister of Japan, Mr. Shinzo Abe, who I would say, like President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, said there are men who are doing their best to level the playing field. And we call them progressive men, and we must work with them. And I just want to quote what Mr. Shinzo Abe said. He says we must talk about womenomics. And he says that the more women's advancement in society is promoted, the higher the growth and development rates and overall well-being of society. So we spoke earlier about some of what is needed to increase women's participation in the economy, and I know there is a panel that's going to deal with that, so I won't go much into detail. But the first issue in this regard is that women are the majority of the poor in the world. So we must therefore make sure that in the forefront of the fight to eradicate poverty, we put women at that center of poverty eradication post-2015. Because if we don't eradicate poverty amongst women, we will never make the necessary impact in dealing with eradication of poverty. And I also want to just say that as women, we cannot talk about eradicating extreme poverty. We just don't want poverty, period. We don't want to be poor, but not extremely poor. So we must put post-2015 assist our sisters who are in the committees to fight that we get eradication of poverty. Secondly, in Africa, we would like to build shared prosperity, and we therefore would like to industrialize, beneficiate, and add value to natural resources. And of course, we also want to bring more and more women entrepreneurs. For Africa, more than over 50% of self-employed are women. But the challenge, according to the World Bank study, is not helping more women becoming entrepreneurs where they are already very active, but rather to enable them to shift from being in the lower informal sector to being in the higher normal sector of business. And we're mentioning all these things because women parliamentarians have a big responsibility within Parliament to make sure that those policies are in place. And I cannot conclude without referring to women leadership in the home. We remain responsible for the socialization of the next generation of boys and girls. And it is therefore important for us to socialize boys and girls in the way we would like to see them as adults. Because adults can only bring back to society what society gave to them as children. So it's very important that we begin shifting how we socialize boys and girls. If we want a world of equality, it must start with socializing our boys and girls. And of course, we must socialize them in a way that they must be equal, they must reach their full potential, and they must be committed to equality and the well-being of the human race and our planet. But women in positions of power in politics, government, parliament, business, civil society also have the responsibility to advocate for greater inclusion and to advocate for a safe, more peaceful, more just, more sustainable, and more prosperous world for both men and women. Sometimes we've seen how women make it, but they make it in a man's world, and they remain in that man's world without changing that world to be a woman and to be a human world, so that more and more women can find it easy to advance. And in our part of the world, we say, if you climb the ladder as the woman, don't push the ladder when you get to the top. Leave it for other women to climb. And of course, as women, parliamentarians and women in different positions, we should act as role models for both young girls and young boys. And I would like to just end by saying, whatever advances we have achieved, we owe it to past generations. We must not forget that. Past generation of women fighters, but we have to make sure that we bequeath future generations with a better world than the one we live in. So that's our responsibility, and I think I'd like just to remember Wangari Maathai, who said, in her usual nonsense manner, women are responsible for their children. They cannot sit back, waste time, and see them starve. And that's the responsibility we have. Thank you.
Thank you so very much for these strong words to you sisters as you addressed many of us here, all of us here. And I would like now to give our next keynote speaker, Portia Simpson-Miller, the floor. She is the first ever female Prime Minister of Jamaica and also holds the Ministry of Defense position. So very warm welcome and thank you so much for being here.
Madam Chairperson, the Chair of the African Union, my sister Honorable Zuma, heads of government, members of government, ladies and gentlemen, organizers of this wonderful conference. It is a distinct honor for me to have been invited to address you at this important forum. The work of the European Union has demonstrated leadership in the advocacy for gender equality. The adoption last year of 3 major reports on gender and governance by the European Parliament demonstrates that the EU remains committed to the empowerment of women. Whether by coincidence or by design, your event follows on Monday's International Day for the Elimination of Violence Against Women. I take this opportunity to recognize the 16 days of activism for the elimination of violence against women and share my delight that this global forum falls most appropriately in the middle of their commemoration. United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Madame Nave Pillay, reminded us recently that violence against women remains one of the greatest scourges of our time, lurking around virtually every street corner. Abuse, poverty, domination, and lack of opportunity often causes many of our sisters worldwide to believe that they cannot raise their heads, voices, or aspirations to political expectations. As we deliberate, we must examine the issue of female leadership style that addresses policies that are geared towards increasing awareness about combating and ultimately eliminating all gender-based violence. Ladies and gentlemen, today we as women leaders converge to reassess our understanding of leadership and to consider how female leadership can reshape our contemporary societies with their attendant development challenges. In this forum, there will be some deliberation on the lamentably low levels of participation of women in representational politics globally. You will also no doubt explore the differences that can and have been made by female leadership. Great strides have been made towards increasing the numbers of female leaders globally, and validating female leadership as authentic. Across the world, over time, women like Golda Meir, Indira Gandhi, Benazir Bhutto, Margaret Thatcher, legendary female leaders of Sri Lanka, Philippines, and Portugal, paved the way for female world leaders. In the Caribbean, as young aspiring leaders, we also held in high regard the first woman prime minister of a CARICOM nation, the late Dame Eugenia Charles of Dominica. I use this platform to honor the women who blazed trails, often at great personal cost, to create a world in which female political leadership would not continue to be an exception, but a valid expectation. These women refused to be defined by the constraints that sought to confine them, particularly in the realm of politics. The constraints associated with gender, class, and racial conventions of their time succeeded in keeping many below the proverbial glass ceiling through which they were free to look, but few could transcend. I took the decision that no matter what in Jamaica, I was going to smash that glass ceiling. I felt that the time was right, that a woman should rise to the challenge and not only talk about the issues affecting women, children, and men, but to be able to do something about it. Ladies and gentlemen, 30 years on, our small CARICOM group has benefited from the efforts of at least 13 women serving either as heads of government or heads of state. We currently have 2 female heads of government and 3 heads of state in our region. Not enough, but we are working at it. In Jamaica, significant strides have since been made in improving the status and involvement of women in all spheres, including economic and political empowerment. Through successive policies over decades, many injustices and inequities faced by women have also been addressed. As Jamaica's first female Prime Minister, I see myself as opening a door, smashing that proverbial glass ceiling in order to let many of my younger sisters through. I often point to the song sung by Jamaican reggae artist Tony Rebel, who sings, "Be careful what you teach the little children. Make sure it is not something to hurt them. Mind what you say to my daughter. She could become your doctor. Mind what you say to my sister. She could become the next Prime Minister." And this was done before I became Prime Minister. Jamaica can proudly showcase women in key leadership positions, such as the Chief Justice of Jamaica, appointed when I became Prime Minister the first time. And we now have the Director of Public Prosecutions, woman. Also in education, in the education system, most of the educators are women. And in health, the health sectors, primarily, as well as several successful businesswomen and professionals. Colleagues, each of us came to our position of leadership through different journeys. Some have come consequent to a radical feminist standpoint. Some became involved through participation in grassroots movements. Others may have simply felt, like Eugenia Charles did, that women had the right to do what they wanted to do. Despite this, there are still 6 parliamentary chambers in the world today having absolutely no women members. Globally, there's an insufficiency of women political leaders. A more careful examination of the statistics certainly elicits cause for concern. As of January 31, 2013, globally, the average share of women in parliament stood at only 20.4%. This was an increase from 19.6% in January 2012 due to, in many instances, the introduction of systems of quota. And those quotas are serving in some countries. Colleagues, 20.4% is still a far cry from the 40% ideal advocated by the Millennium Development Goals, calls for women's roles and rights to be considered as decision makers in the formal economy and development. Consequently, we must establish a template which overcomes the subtle and diverse structural barriers to create governance and development agendas that are sustainable, lead to a visible change in gender equality, have an impact on the political context, represents an innovative approach, and can be replicated. Former President of Chile, Bachelet, who also headed UN Women, asserts that when one woman is a leader, it changes her. When more women are leaders, it changes policies and politics. In a New York Times bestseller, writer D.D. Myers, former White House press secretary, challenged her readers with a provocative and bold book entitled Why Women Should Rule the World. Ms. Myers argues that when the contribution of women to politics is taken into account, it becomes clear that they bring a different perspective to their jobs. They also pay attention to a broader set of issues. She acknowledged that women leaders do not focus exclusively on traditional women's issues, nor do they necessarily define themselves as womanist or feminist. Generally and fundamentally, women leaders initiate and fight for bills that champion social justice, environmental protection, and fight for families. Their perspective have great bearing on the economy, international relationships, and all the issues that affect the citizens of their country on a daily basis. Women's life experiences are essentially and enduring different from men. In the here and now, as women leaders in the midst of global financial crisis, we must avoid some of the traditional mistakes of political leadership. We have to be mindful of, while balancing the books, we balance people's lives. If women are not at the decision-making table, their long-term impact is negligible. The first task, therefore, is to get more women to the table. We must also recognize the valuable input that many male leaders have made in the empowerment and advancement of both men and women in societies. I'll never forget when I was called by former Prime Minister Michael Manley, now deceased, as a young parliamentarian, and appointed me Minister of Labour, Social Security, Women's Affairs and Sport. The critics said she couldn't manage. She did not have the experience. And I demonstrated to the country that I took the Ministry of Labour at a time when every day there were strikes, here and there. And when I left the Ministry of Labour, no more strikes. Created a stable industrial relations environment in Jamaica that is lasting up to now. I was then assigned by P.J. Patterson to the Ministry of Tourism, Entertainment, Sport and Women's Affairs. And then to Local Government, Community Development, Sport and Women's Affairs. And so I'll never forget that while I am in the position I am in my country, that I am to take other women along the journey with me. And I am doing that, just that. And I have one young female in the, I have two young women in the Office of the Prime Minister as ministers. I assigned her the responsibility for sport. Will you stand, Natalie? And the other to Information and Women's Affairs. Because of Press Week, she could not join us. She could not be here, and we asked Natalie to be here instead. And so as female leaders, we have a responsibility not only to talk about the issues affecting women, but to influence the change that we would like to see. Let us seek to forge a new path in the arena of leadership that is inclusive of our gendered reality. Perhaps the time has come for women leaders, especially those of us who lead developing and post-colonial societies, to make concerted efforts to recapture the essence of the lives of our courageous foremothers. We must never forget their struggles and their work. And today, we are standing on their shoulders. We must be woman and courageous. Woman, and we need not apologize that we are women. We should be proud. Every man on this earth are here because of a combination of partnership, man and woman together. Woman of our time and woman for our time. And we must also bear in mind that it is said, women hold up half the sky. I say no, women hold up all the sky. I hope that all of us can find the courage to do the things that must be done to have a lasting impact on a world that should be prosperous, peaceful, and just to all our citizens. Every time they take a board to cabinet meetings, and I look at it and I ask, so where are the women? Take it back to me when I can see some women represented on the board. And so I stand before you, a girl from a deep rural community in Woodhall, St. Catherine in Jamaica, who walked through the fire to become Prime Minister of Jamaica. Because when a woman stands for leadership, she's always treated differently from the men and faced much more criticism. But you know what? I never looked back. I always look up and look forward and try to move forward. And I encourage female leaders, never listen too much to the critics. Constructive criticisms, yes, we must pay attention to. But we must never pay too much attention to the critics, or we might begin to think negatively ourselves. Always remain focused and positive about what we're doing and what we're about. It has not been an easy road, but we have come a long way, and we still have a long way to go. I urge women of our world to bring your womanhood to leadership. Do not be ambivalent about it. That is your strength. It is who you are and who you must be for your people. I give you strength from a Jamaican poet, Jean Wilson, who pleads with us to stop smalling up ourselves in her poem, No More Smalling Up of Me. For those without fluency in the Jamaican patois, that means stop acting as if you are less than who you are. Start showcasing your talents. How? She says, no more living in this prison, barricaded by my fears. No more turning and retreating in the face of new frontiers. And so I say to you, onward and upward, women in parliaments, as we seek to be the best women leaders we can be for our nations and our people. One love. And if we all unite and work together in one love, I am sure everything will be all right. Thank you. Blessings. Thank you.